Hey everyone, a really warm welcome back. Welcome to the channel. In this episode, I want to talk through the bike rack that we opted for. We've chosen the Fiamma T6 tailgate rack, explain why we went for that one, and then show putting it together because this rack comes in kit form, unlike the VW specific one. So let's get into the video. See, this is what the kit looks like, and we're going to have to put it all together to transform it into a rack itself. And there are a few positives and negatives about this rack, so I'll talk through those as we go through the construction and say from our point of view. So a pair of reasonably practical people who are capable of doing these things, what's good, what's bad, and a few things for improvement actually, because there's a couple of things that didn't work as well as they could have done, I think. So this thing is made black by being painted over a standard aluminium version of the frame, I would suspect, which makes it very difficult to put together actually, because if you can imagine, you've got the tubes themselves. So in making the framework that sits on the van permanently, then you have a thinner tube with a thicker tube over the top, and then you have to get a bolt down through the two of them to hold everything together. And this has all been designed, of course, with standard size aluminium diameter aluminium tubing. And then of course, if you put a fine coat of paint over the top of those, that makes that connection very, very difficult to make, because it was already tight, I imagine, with the standard size tube anyway. So I had a layer of paint over the outside and a bit of overspray from the outer tube, and you can imagine there's many layers of paint in there. So this was really difficult to put together actually. We ended up using a rubber mallet very gently, trying to tap them together. And of course, trying to get the two tubes precisely lined up, not just in the rotating direction, but also in the how far in direction the inner tube has to go within the outer tube, because of course you've got to get a specific bolt down through the middle there, and you've got a square hole on the top tube and a square hole on the inner tube to receive the top of the bolt, and then round holes to line up at the bottom. That was really tricky because of course if you're gently tapping this in, nothing moves smoothly. So of course every time you tap you get a sudden jolt, so you've got to really judge that, and it's very, very difficult to do. In the end, what we did was we had a tent peg through the top hole, and that was then pressing on the inner tube as it was coming in, so we could much more easily feel where the hole was, because there are no markers on this inner tube, so you have no idea how much that has to be within the outer one before you find the hole. So we had a tent peg coming in down through the top. You can imagine it was just poking through. As the inner tube came through, then you could feel where you were, as long as you got that rotation right. And of course, measuring as well helps. So of course we were having to do this across a very, very thick carpet indeed, and tapping very carefully with wooden blocks between the hammer and the frame itself, because we didn't want to dent it or injure any of the paintwork. We had no idea how tough the paintwork was. We assumed it was powder coated, but we had no idea at the time how tough that would be and whether that would then cause injury. So really annoying to try and put together. And then once the basic framework has been put together, the next stage is to put on these bits of strengthening bar, I guess, sort of like a bit of scaffolding. So because the main tubes themselves are fairly thin, then you add second pieces at the sides and across the bottom, and you bolt those right the way through using plastic spacers that go between the main rack, which is the absolute pain in the neck to put together, and these bits. So getting these side bits on is very easy, you know, it's just a matter of bolting the right things in the right places. It was just that initial bit of getting those 6 bits of tubing into the basic sort of trapezium rack itself that was the absolute pain in the neck. And remember to get these top solid plastic hangers into place in the right way around, because they are handed, so you must have the right one on the right side and the left one on the left side. Obviously there is a slight shape to the tailgate lid itself, and these things are handed, so if you've got them the right way, wrong way around, you know, there's no way you're going to get them clipped over the boot lid itself. So one thing to be very sure of, to make sure you've got the angles right, because otherwise there's no chance of it going back together. And if you've got them wrong, by this point you've got to take the whole of that framework apart in order to swap them over and get them back in the right place. So really, really slowly and carefully at the initial stages to make sure you've got all the bits that are handed the right way around. And it can be quite confusing, and the instructions are not at all clear on which bit needs to go where. So just take a few minutes to think carefully about what that looks like when you're putting it together. It comes as standard for 2 bikes, but we also bought the 3rd and 4th bike upgrade kits. And price-wise, it's very similar to the VW own brand one, so that wasn't a deciding factor at all. Having seen both of them in the flesh, for real, what would you say about an inanimate object? Having seen both of them for real, then I would say that this one seems nowhere near as solid or as well made, and that's consistent actually with the experience we've had of other Fiamma bike racks and other Thule bike racks. We've had quite a bit of equipment from both manufacturers now, but this one is available in black, and it sits much closer to the back of the van, of the glass of the vehicle, and that's both in use when it's got the bikes on and when it's folded up, so it keeps the turning circle of the caravan nice and spacious to maximize the clearance that's available. So we needed a rubber mallet and a few blocks of wood to stop any damage to the thin tubes, and we were working on a very soft, very thick rug to make sure we weren't damaging any of the rack itself. I'm sure that the plain aluminium version will be absolutely fine to slot together, but this black one, because of that extra coating on the top, was an utter pain. Hence there's very little footage actually of that bit, because we got so annoyed with it we just forgot to do the filming. Now each wheel tray fits into its bolts rather like T-tracks on the set of roof bars, so they can be positioned left, right, wherever they need to be, so making sure you've got everything nicely aligned, or if you need to offset things, that can happen as well. And this is especially important with the one that becomes the outside bike, or the top bike, so the one that's furthest from the van when it's mounted, because actually when the rail is folded up, that of course becomes the top rail, and it's a split rail so that it doesn't cover up the high level brake light on the van itself. So when the rack isn't in use and folded, that's a split rail, so you can still see that high level brake light, so you're perfectly safe on the road. The next task was to head outside. Luckily the van was already fairly clean, and apply the stick-on paint protection tapes, and in theory just hang the rack in place and then clamp it onto the tailgate. That's what the little pictures of the instructions seem to suggest. Just make sure your paintwork is absolutely nice and clean, because of course that's then going to be sealed under the sticker itself, and you want the sticker to stick as well as possible and stay there for as long as possible, and of course you don't want to be sealing in any grit or dirt or anything. Oh, and of course don't expect a nice square finish, because obviously the body panels are slightly moulded and the stickers are precisely rectangular, so obviously not going to get a nice square setup here. Right, now before the rack can be hung over, these rubber pads have to be added, and they sit between the hard plastic of the rack, and of course there's a metal clamp that comes, so you get the hard plastic here that sits on the van, and then you get a metal clamp with a sort of jaw on the top, and you have to get that over the boot lid so it can sit in the boot lid itself. And I can tell you that is quite scary indeed, getting this sharp metal piece around the paintwork carefully, so that takes a bit of very careful manoeuvring. Okay, and here's where no language, graphics only, minimal instructions are really not helpful on this type of build. So these instructions simply say cut and stick it on. They don't say anything useful about where to cut, how much to allow at each end of the foot, what should be covered by the rubber, what should stick out, what should not stick out. So in other words, not helpful at all. And I assume it's just for ease of manufacturing that this rubber is supplied separately. It would be so much better if it was installed, and then it would be obvious what you're supposed to be doing with the things. So at first, little one and I left a bit of excess at the top end that would end up inside the rack, because actually I was really worried about that bit of metal clamp on the top, and I was worried about that scratching the paintwork on the vehicle. But as we'll see in a minute, we soon learnt that that was not very helpful at all. Okay, so as you see, it looks like we've got the frame hung over okay, but the lower clamps are miles too high. They've got to clip onto this midsection that sticks out of the tailgate itself. And at this point, having pushed the rack down as far as I possibly could, so therefore assuming it was in the right place, I thought, well, the movable bit of the clamp must be very long, so we can get that around and clamp it into position. Hence, I said about loosening it, and yep, you guessed it, I ended up undoing it far too far, ended up undoing it completely, and the instructions have got warnings in this. They say, don't do it. But then, of course, because it's quite a loose bolt anyway, you have no idea how long the bolt is, and you have no idea how far is too far. The instructions say don't do it, but then don't tell you how to avoid doing it. So, suffice to say, it was not long enough for what I was attempting to get it to do. Now, everything is also inside this plastic foot down here, and it's naturally wobbly, so you can't tell until it's too late. Hopefully watching me make this mistake will then save you from doing it, and you can see the angle that the rack sits on the tailgate, which then will help you not to wiggle that foot too loose, but it was an incredibly tight fit. Anyway, it soon became clear that a second adult really was needed to do this, so Mike was summoned. First, we decided to trim the rubber strip at the top of the plastic hanger thing back quite a bit, because it was really getting in the way of getting that metal part over the boot lid. It was really awkward, so that got trimmed back, and you can see how sharp actually that metal piece was. So you can see why it was causing me serious stress anytime that bit got anywhere near the vehicle paint itself. And then rubber pad trimmed back, then the rack hung much better and hung much lower as well. So that was clearly needed. Had it been stated in the instructions, that would have been helpful. You can see though that the lower foot is still really quite high, and of course the passenger side one had to be fixed. So luckily we have some magnets and tools and long enough spanners and that sort of thing to get that all back together. But to get that lower foot around that lip on the tailgate itself, one of us had to really press down on the top of the rack while the other one clipped it on. But again, there's a metal piece here, so that causes a bit of a panic around the paintwork. And there is a paint protection sticker, but you're trying to stretch a rectangular sticker around a bowed shape, so by the time you put it up, then it doesn't sit flat because you've got a shape that's semi-rounded as well as widening out. So you're trying to get the thing to sit like this, and yeah, it doesn't sit very flat at all. Just flat enough to be able to get the foot in, but I'm not expecting it to last and to keep that nice shape for long at all. So I guess in terms of design improvements, I'd like to see some proper adjustability on these top hanging brackets. That metal piece goes over the top and it clips onto the hard plastic foot. And you can see in the footage there are a couple of screws up here, but you're not allowed to touch these screws at all. So what would be more sensible is perhaps if there's a bolt up there which allows you a bit of flexibility between the metal bracket that clips over the tailgate door and the plastic thing, because getting the tailgate in here is really difficult. So you've got to get the whole rack up and come in from above and then to be able to clip it down, but you've got no space at all between the overhang of the bracket and the hard plastic bit here to actually get that in sensibly and then push it down. Really tricky job. So other improvements would be much more travel on those lower brackets, and some sort of indication of when you're going too far, so you make sure you don't loosen those too much. And then of course to have those rubber strips properly built in at the top, and then there's no confusion about how much you should be cutting off or shouldn't be cutting off, or whether you're doing the right thing as you're going along and doing the fitting, because it's not at all clear from the instructions. I think it's simply an attempt to make the manufacturing easier by putting the onus on the owner of the rack to put it all together. So once everything was in place and tightened up, you know, it was all solid and it was perfectly fine, but I did not enjoy having those sharp metal brackets so close to the paintwork on the van itself. You know, that was causing a serious amount of stress, especially as they were so tight and so difficult to maneuver around, and you're trying to maneuver an entire rack and get the thing on the back at the same time. That was quite annoying. So close up you can see how much that rubber strip has had to be pressed down, required quite a bit of force to get that to move. And then the last thing we had to do before the actual bike tray bit could go on was to drill a hole through the solid plastic bracket, which had a hole in already, into the metal frame. Now, why on earth you have to drill a hole and there isn't a pre-drilled hole there already? It makes no sense to me at all, because it's not as if everybody has a different tailgate. You know, these are manufactured to a mold, so there should be a correct way of fitting it. I can only imagine that because you require so much force to get the thing to sit down, that perhaps people do it slightly differently, hence leaving you to drill the final hole and put that securing couple of screws in, one on each side. But that's quite annoying. I'd like that to be done more professionally, I think, within the design itself. Okay, and then at last, because all that assembly was quite tricky, and then the last thing to do is just to get the bike trays on themselves. And believe it or not, this bit is really, really easy. Slightly concerning in the sense of the tray. So the tray with the 4 racks on is a separate unit itself, and that's held onto the main framework with just 1 bolt in each side, which was a little bit concerning considering the weight of the trays that's being held. But the way in which it's being held, you've got the vertical of the main frame itself that's held on the back of the van, and then you've got the bike tray here, which is lowered on a diagonal bracket that is held on by the bolt. So the bolt goes through here, you get a diagonal bracket that holds this framework in place, and then at the end of this framework you've got a rubber foot which pushes against this vertical as well. So you've got the bolt which is holding it still, but you've also got the weight being taken through this rubber foot. So hopefully it's okay, but obviously keep an eye on your bolts, because you don't want those two coming loose and then the whole of the weight of the bike's toppling off the back. And then it's a couple of simple plastic brackets to hold it all closed. Alright then, Mike tidied and tightened all the bolts and the nuts and so on, and the tyre trays themselves. Because there seemed to be a mix of steel bolts in aluminium here, we were a little concerned that they weren't all very well coated, so we gave them all a little squirt of some hydrophobic lube stuff to prevent any rust. And then I can put all the top arms in place. As it's future me narrating most of this, I can tell you now that actually driving around with these arms in place is a real pain, because it completely blocks the rear view, and they need adjusting every time anyway that you put a bike on, so I've tended to leave them off almost all the time, I think. You'll have spotted the red strap around the top. This was holding the rack closed, so the rack has only actually popped open once, but it was one hell of a shocking thump when it did happen, hence the strap. And a few weeks after the strap was in place, I did actually replace it with a couple of bits of paracord and a quick release carabiner, so that's proved very practical indeed. I don't think the rack's tried to come open again, but as I said, it was one hell of a thump, and I wouldn't want it to happen again. Last thing to say in terms of build quality before I show you the footage from checking the towing clearances is that the finish is pretty good, except here in the tyre trays, where you can see how it was sprayed from the original aluminium itself, so not so well coated in the bottom of the tyre trays. It doesn't massively matter, but it just shows how it was put together. Alright, so to finish off, let's have a look at some pictures I've taken while I was towing with the rack on and when I had a couple of bikes on there. What I would dearly love to do in the future is put a GoPro up on, perhaps in the front of the caravan or on the rack somewhere, so I can be absolutely sure of what the clearances are when we're towing along, but I haven't done that yet, so just a few pictures to show you of what we've done so far. So as I said, this is why we went for the rack. It sits really close to the van, the tow van, what tow car it would be if it, yeah, It's a bit big for a car. Anyway, fully extended, it's around 56-60-ish centimeters behind the bumper. And I hooked up the Caravan. So when I had the Caravan hooked up, and we used to have that bike frame on the A-frame of the Caravan itself, we used to have 66 centimeters of clearance between the rear of the bumper and the front of the rack, obviously with no bikes on. Now, I've never had an issue, although I was carrying, the kids' small bikes, and they're much bigger these days. But when I was reversing out of the Caravan service centre one day, the chap who was watching me back did comment that the rack seemed awfully close to the bumper. It was a pretty tight 3-point turn, but obviously that played on the mind a bit, as I thought I'd measured everything carefully, but you never quite know, do you? There's nothing like seeing it for real. Now this rack, because it's on the back of the van, it's also much, much higher, so it easily clears the jockey wheel, whereas if we had a full set of bikes on the A-frame rack, it didn't, so that made getting the jockey wheel up and down a bit of a pain, so you had to take the front bike off. So jockey wheel is cleared by miles, which is great, and of course the Caravan slopes back towards the top, towards that front window, so I've now got about 85 centimeters of clearance, so an extra 20 centimeters, even though I can now take 4 bikes, not the 3 that I could take on the A-frame rack on the Caravan. So as I said, I haven't had a chance to take a video yet, but taken a few photos, including when we were leaving a CL that had a pretty tight bend to come out. So the van was probably at, 50 degrees, 45 degrees, something like that to the Caravan itself. So I was able to take some of these photos on that particular angle to check what the clearance was. And of course I had big bikes on the back, rather than little diddy small ones, because my kids are way past diddy little small ones these days. So closing comments. It was a bit of a pig to put together. I'm not going to beat around the bush. This channel's all about truth and realism and so on, and we're two fairly technical people with a reasonable set of tools, still amateurs, but interested amateurs, and we found it really quite annoying to put together. However, having said that, this is the only one that was available in black, and it sat much closer to the back of the van, so it kept the towing clearance nice and wide, and so far that has worked out fine. I need to prove it to myself with the GoPro, but initial impressions so far working really, really well. When I bought this rack, the only possibilities were the VW own one in aluminium. If you wanted that in black, there were people that were offering to take it apart and spray paint it, powder coat it for you and put it back together. That would have cost an extra £200-300 because that's a very time involved process to get them to do that. And as I said, the VW one is much bigger in terms of how far it sticks out the back, although seems to be better built and from better materials. These days, Thule have brought out something called a Wanderway, which is available as standard in a 2-bike rack, and you can also buy the 3 and 4 bike extension for that. It looks, from the marketing material that I've seen, I haven't seen one live yet, it looks a very similar size and shape to the VW one, so I suspect it still sticks out quite a long way from the back of the van. If you're not towing, that's not an issue. That you'll probably be better off with that, because it means the pedals are further from the back glass, so you don't have to worry about any of that sort of stuff and making sure you've got clearance there, and your bikes are probably further apart as well. They are a little bit close on this Fiamma one, so I do have to be very careful about frames crossing and making sure that there's no sort of jiggling of one bike pressing on another one. So the Wanderway is made as standard in a mixture of stainless steel and black, so would work great on any vehicle. So I think Thule have really dealt with that a hole in the market, if you like, for people that want a really good rack and want it in black, because the grey colour of a van was very popular, certainly when we got ours, and the black looks great with all sorts of different colour combinations as well. Alright, so thanks for watching. I hope sharing our experience was useful, especially if you're trying to consider which rack you want for your van, and the pros and cons of each one of those things. If it was, give us a thumbs up. If you enjoyed it and you're not interested in bike racks at all, still give us a thumbs up, and do drop a comment below, because it's always lovely to hear from everybody and to hear your thoughts and share best practice. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I guess we'll see you in the next one. So bye for now. See ya.